Welcome everybody to another Gary Chamberlain online seminar in econometrics. Today we are really happy to have Max Kasy presenting multiple papers on experimental design. And we are also really grateful for our two discussants, David McKenzie and Max Tabord-Meehan. At this point, I would like to formally announce that this whole webinar is being recorded in order to be published online on the Chamberlain Seminar website. And for questions, we would like to ask you to use the chat functionality in Zoom. And once your question is submitted, we will try to coordinate with you so that ideally you will be called as soon as Max stops to ask your question yourself or to ask a question later in the Q&A. If for some reason you cannot ask the question yourself, I could also ask it for you. And finally, if we don't get to your question in 90 minutes, then all questions will ultimately be given in text form to Max. So every question that is being asked will actually reach the speaker. So without any further ado, I would like to give the stage to Max Kasy. He has an ambitious schedule of 5 papers ahead of him. And Max, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks, I believe. Thanks for the introduction, Martin, and thanks for having me. So I am going to talk today about alternative objectives and what they imply for experimental design. And the perspective I want to take is a perspective of decision theory, which I hope is something that Gary Chamberlain would approve of. And more specifically, the decision problem that I'm interested in is how should we assign treatments in an experiment, given whatever the available information is at the time of treatment assignment and given whatever our objective function is. And so anytime that we're considering a decision problem, there's a bunch of things we have to specify beforehand. The first object that we need to specify is the objective function. That's maybe the most crucial one. And so objective function means what's the ultimate goal of the experiment? Why do we run an experiment to begin with? What will the experimental data be used for? The second thing we have to decide on is what's the action space. So in this context, that means in particular, what information can experimental treatment assignments depend on? And then the third question we have to settle on is how do we go about solving a decision problem? And there are again different approaches to that. One might try to find a fully optimal solution to a decision problem, which in many cases is hard or feasible, or one might try to go for some heuristic solution and then hope to prove ex post that it has good properties. And lastly, we might have to decide how to evaluate a solution. So this is where different statistical paradigms come in. And from a frequentist point of view, we might care about the risk function, so the behavior of procedure conditional on the state of the world, a parameter. From a Bayesian perspective, we might care about base risk averaging over the prior, or again, a more frequentist perspective, considering worst case scenarios. Okay, so what are possible objective functions for experiments? Here, 4 that can come to mind. First one is maybe the most traditional one that has motivated a lot of standard recommendations for experimental design, which is the squared error of estimates. So we might care, for instance, about estimating the average treatment effect in an experiment, or we might care about multiple estimates and then maybe care about some weighted sum of the squared errors of these estimates. The second objective, which is the objective that has motivated much of the multi-armed bandit literature, is the objective of maximizing in-sample average outcomes. And there are all kinds of generalizations of this objective that we might consider that fall roughly in the same class. So you might care about transformed outcomes if you have inequality aversion. You might take into account costs. You might discount if you have time preferences and so on. The third objective is one that has maybe received less attention in the literature, which is policy choice. So here the idea is we run the experiment, and after the experiment, we make some policy recommendation that's implemented on a larger scale. And so here then we would evaluate the experiment based on the policy choice that we make after the experiment. And so you can have this policy choice objective if you care about observed outcomes, and that puts it more in a similar class as the bandit objectives, item number 2. Or you might care kind of closer to microeconomic theory, welfare economics, public finance. You might care about utilitarian welfare. So this would be an objective where we do not observe on the individual level that it is the maximize, instead we have to indirectly infer it from people's choices. And so that would be usually operationalized via the notion of equivalent variation that's then aggregated across people with some alpha weights. And so what I want to do today is discuss a number of papers briefly, where I consider each of these 4 objectives in turn. So that was the first item. We had to specify for decision problems the objective function. The second item is the question of what's the action space. And so action space in the context of an experiment means in particular what information can treatment assignments condition on. And so first question is, can we condition on predetermined covariates? So if that's yes, then we're in a setting of stratified or targeted treatment assignment, or in the appended literature it's often called the contextual case. And the second question is, does the experiment take place over time, and do we observe outcomes for earlier units, earlier participants, either in a sequential manner or in a batched manner, or maybe in a staggered manner? And if we can condition on earlier outcomes, then we're in an adaptive setting, in an adaptive treatment assignment problem. And so the settings I'm going to talk about today, I'm first going to talk explicitly about covariates, then I'm going to drop them just for simplicity of notation and exposition. And I'm going to start with a non-adaptive case, and then I'm going to move on to adaptive experiments. The third dimension of specifying a decision problem is, how do we approach optimization? And so one approach would be to really try and solve for the fully optimal design, right? So given, once you've specified your action space, specified your objective function, in principle, all you have to do is solve an optimization problem. So conceptually, it's straightforward. In an adaptive case, that would be a dynamic stochastic optimization problem. In practice, it's very challenging often to solve these. And so this is the kind of approach that has traditionally been preferred in the economic theory literature. And as a consequence, this literature has focused on tractable, but not necessarily practically relevant, simplified settings. Also to note, in fully optimal designs, randomization actually doesn't play a role. On the other hand, you might kind of take a more engineering perspective and consider approximately optimal or rate optimal heuristic designs. So here the idea is just come up with whatever heuristic comes to your mind, run it in practice. If it seems to work, you're happy, and then kind of call the mathematicians and have them prove, kind of expose that what you're doing has some optimality or guarantees, or at least some rate optimality guarantees. And this is the approach that I would argue has been preferred in the machine learning literature. And so I think this is really the approach that has really revived the multi-arm bandit literature in particular, and also reinforcement learning and so on, where the setups that these literatures consider have been around for more than 80 years, 90 years in, but then it's been kind of dormant for a long time, and only with this switch to more heuristic approaches and in more complex realistic settings, this has really taken off, especially in the context of online experimentation. And so this is also the kind of approach I want to emphasize today, focusing on approximately optimal algorithms. I'm going to also focus on Bayesian algorithms. So there's a prior that enters the algorithmic design, but I'm going to evaluate the algorithm from a risk function perspective. So from a frequentist perspective, my characterizations are not going to depend on the prior. All right, so what are the papers I'm going to discuss? As I said, I have like 6 papers on the list. So these first 3 I'm actually going to discuss in some detail. The first one is a little bit older, but I decided to include it in this talk since it, I think, fits kind of nicely in this arc that I want to span here. The second one, we literally finished the draft 3 days ago. So feedback on that one will be very much appreciated. And that's a paper with a whole bunch of co-authors. It's a more applied paper where we actually conducted an adaptive targeted field experiment in Jordan in the context of job search assistance for Syrian refugees. The third paper is a bit more theoretical, so that one focuses on the average outcome objective for policy choice. So you run the experiment, and then after the experiment, you pick a policy. And then I have 3 more work in progress pieces that I probably won't get to discussing in detail. I might want to talk a little bit about the last one, given the current how do we optimally, in a targeted manner, use tests for infectious diseases in a pandemic. All right, so one of the things that I find fascinating about the questions, this whole literature, is that there are so many different academic fields that really have contributed to it. And so you find papers in operations research, computer science, in machine learning, artificial intelligence, in economic theory, in clinical research, biostatistics, and so on, which also causes a bit of a mess because all of these literatures kind of develop their own terminology and notation and don't necessarily communicate with each other. But I think there's also kind of a lot of scope still for intellectual arbitrage, learning from these different fields and kind of adapting the ideas from other fields to the settings that might be relevant in economics, for instance. So yeah, let me maybe stop for a minute here and see if there's a couple of questions. I think you're on mute, Martin.
There I am. At the moment, we don't have audience questions, but one thing I might ask you, Max, is to actually try switching off your video. We discussed this in advance because that might help with your sound quality. So let's try this for a moment, whether that's better. So the one thing I was wondering while you were speaking was actually what type of data structures you were thinking of. Because if you think of the bandit problem, you really have a long time period in mind, like time series in mind. While if you think of controlling for a lot of covariates, you think of a lot of cross-section. So what data structures did you actually have in mind here?
So it's for the adaptive settings, I will specify in more detail, but it will be repeated cross-sections. So I'm mostly interested here in field experiment settings, where it's kind of most practical to run these in batches. And usually there will be a number of waves. Really depends on the application. I think it starts being interesting at 2 waves for many of these. In other settings, you might go into the hundreds of waves.
Okay.
It depends.
Yeah. So both cross-section and time. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you go on at this point. Thank you.
So here's the first theorem. Consider any decision problem, so a completely general abstract decision problem, and consider either base risk or worst case risk, so either the Bayesian or the frequentist perspective. Then the optimal risk, if you only allow for deterministic procedures, is not going to be any worse than when you allow for randomized procedures. And additionally, if the optimal deterministic procedure is unique among the deterministic procedures, then it actually has strictly lower risk than any non-trivial randomized procedure. So this is something that various people have noticed over the years. To show. So if you look at the risk function of any randomized procedures and you write out what it is, then you can just write it as a weighted average of the risk functions for the deterministic procedures that you're implicitly averaging over, right? Where the weights are the probabilities of your randomization device. And so that means you have a convex combination of the risk of deterministic procedures, and the best element of the convex combination is going to be at least weakly better than the combination itself. And if the things you're averaging over, the best one is strictly better than the others, then it's going to be strictly better than any non-trivial weighted average. So that means from a purely decision theoretic perspective, there is no need to randomize. And that implies in particular, if you consider the problem of experimental design as a decision problem, there is also in and of itself no reason to randomize. And to make this a little bit more specific, let's consider the setting of kind of a canonical field experiment where I take the sampling part is given. So we have collected a sample of n units, we've conducted a baseline survey, and from the baseline survey, we have a vector of covariance xi for every unit. And then kind of the key interesting stage now is item 2. We have to decide on the assignment of a binary treatment di for everybody, where everybody's treatment assignment can depend on the whole matrix of covariates, so for themselves and for everybody else, and on possibly on the randomization device u. Then outcomes are realized. I assume the usual potential outcome framework with no spillovers, and then we're estimating the average treatment effect. And we're going to evaluate our estimate in terms of the squared error. And so here now I want to construct the procedure using the Bayesian approach. And in order to do that, I need a prior distribution. And I want to be non-parametric here. I don't want to rely on any parametric assumptions about how treatments and covariates and outcomes are related. And one way to do that that's popular in machine learning and robotics and so on is using Gaussian process priors. where the key object I need a prior for here is this function fxt. That's the conditional expectation of potential outcome yd conditional on covariate value x. And one way to impose a prior for that would be to assume a Gaussian process, which is characterized by its first and second moments. And so particularly the second moment here, that would be the covariance term. So the prior covariance of fxt and fx prime d prime for different values xt and x prime d prime. And going to denote that by c. And then for a given treatment assignment, I can collect things in a matrix and vector. So I can collect the prior variance covariance matrix for our end observations of fxd. And I can also collect the prior covariances of fxd with the average treatment effect beta. So all of these just depend on the treatment assignment, the covariance, and the prior. I don't need the outcomes for them. And then I'll take the estimator for the average treatment effect, the posterior best linear predictor. And so once I have this set up, right, so maybe Gaussian process priors are not as familiar, but essentially it's just a joint normal distribution, and I can look at the conditional variance of this joint normal distribution. And that conditional variance is going to be my mean squared error for my average treatment effect estimator. And so one way of writing that is as the prior variance for the average treatment effect minus the variance of the predictor, which has the sandwich form here, covariance times variance inverse times covariance. And so this, by definition, is the mean squared error, the base risk of any given treatment assignment here. Right, so the treatment assignment doesn't affect the prior variance of beta, but it does enter the second term here. And so then, given the setup, we have that the optimal design is the one that minimizes the base risk, this formula for the expected squared error. And this continuous covariance, we're going to have that this optimum is generically unique, which means that the non-random treatment assignment is optimal. And so one way to think of this expression here, this sandwich term, is that it's really an expression that measures the balance between the treated group and the control group. It's just an expression for balance that's derived from first principles in some sense. Now, how do we optimize this? Then it gets numerically a bit challenging again, and randomization might enter the picture again. So one way of doing that is something that applied people actually do a fair amount, is re-randomizing until you're satisfied with balance. And so variant here would be just picking, say, 1,000 different random treatment assignments and then just keeping the one with the best mean squared error. And now, of course, there are counter arguments to the argument I just made against randomization. And I think the two leading ones are the ones I put here. The first one is that one reason people like randomization experiments is because they like randomization inference, which is fair. I think an interesting corollary of that, though, is that there's no way of justifying randomization inference from a decision theoretic point of view. So I guess take that as you will. Second counter argument that has been made is that if you're minimizing a worst case risk, but worst case only given your decision procedure but not given the randomization device, then again mixed strategies can be optimal. So this is basically a general argument against any form of stratification. So this is not just for my procedure, it's for against any stratification. And here the idea is essentially you can, if you think of this as a game against adversarial nature, then you pick your decision procedure, then nature picks like the worst state of the world, and then you randomize the randomization devices, in some sense tricking the evil nature that's playing against you. Yeah, so I'll stop here again for questions.
Okay, thank you, Max. We have by Isaiah Andrews.
Great, thanks very much, Martin. So yeah, Max, I mean, actually the question I wanted to ask is sort of related to the last point you touch on here, which is that sort of your non-randomization argument hinges on sort of what's the information set where you're evaluating the risk, right? In some sense, are you evaluating the worst case risk conditional on randomization or prior to the randomization taking place? And I guess I'm sort of curious on how you think about that in some sense, because it's, you know, if we're evaluating an experiment after the results have already been reported, then sort of it makes sense to condition on randomization. On the other hand, if we're evaluating an experiment at the experimental design phase, then it feels like maybe I shouldn't condition on randomization. And how do you sort of, here you're sort of adopting this perspective where you condition on randomization, but I'd be interested in hearing you say a bit more about how do you think about the trade-off there, right? How do you think about which of those is the right information set?
That's a great question. So I think there's kind of a couple of things to be said here. I guess one is, there's the mathematical result. If you condition on everything, you don't want to randomize. If you only condition the procedure but not the randomization device, then randomization can be optimal. So those are just math facts. Now then there's kind of the more conceptual or philosophical question: which one is the more appealing notion of worst case risk that you worry about? And I think you can legitimately have different perspectives here. I think if you look at what applied empirical practice is, then people do very much worry if randomization generates imbalances, right? So if you run an experiment and it turns, say, and you have ages one of your covariates, and all of the old people ended up in the treatment group and all the young people in the control group, I think applied people would be worried about that. And I think rightly so, because it essentially tells them, for the experiment at hand, there is no reason to think that the difference in means is a trustworthy estimate of the average treatment effect. But again, I think you can have a different opinion. I find it more appealing to think about worst case risk given everything.
Okay, thank you. Can I actually ask a very quick clarifying question? This matrix C, which was the covariance of the expected value y given x, so you're assuming that this is known here, right? That I have a prior on this and that I can plug that in.
Yeah. So you have a prior on this function f, which is the expectation of potential outcomes given x.
Right.
And then the matrix C depends on the fixed given covariance x, but it also depends on your treatment assignment D. So as you change the treatment assignment, the matrix C changes. But other than that, it is known. Right.
But it's a very big object, so one might be worried that this is misspecified or something.
I mean, a prior is a prior, right? And so there's various ways of getting reasonable priors, and you can try to calibrate it to prior data. There's a whole bunch of like default choices that people use, which are essentially just assuming some form of continuity or smoothness of this function f. So it's kind of equivalent, I think, to assuming smoothness or not. And that type of information goes in here for the most part. Okay. You could assume linearity of the function f, in which case it reduces to imposing a prior on the coefficients of the regression. And then actually, interestingly, the balance expression reduces to just the balance of the covariate means. So then it's just a matter of checking that each of the covariate means is the same across the treatment arms.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Max. And I let you go on at this point. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. So let me move on now away from this kind of classical objective of squared error to other objectives. So if your only goal is just to get a precise estimate of a causal effect, then this is a very reasonable thing to do, or some variant of such procedures. But in many cases, we also want to help participants in an experiment as much as possible. I think there are strong ethical arguments to be made for that. So a famous formulation of that would be, for instance, by Immanuel Kant, who has argued that you should always act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. And so I think especially in like a social science context or also a biomedical context, there are strong arguments to be made that we should care about the welfare of our experimental participants. And then you might also care about both. So you might care both about getting precise treatment effects and your participant welfare. And that was the case for this applied project I'm going to talk about next, which motivated us to introduce this Tabord-Thompson algorithm that I will introduce shortly. And so here's the setup. So there's a bit of notation on this slide, but that's all the notation. So here we're going to now be in an adaptive setting. So that's where this becomes interesting. Adaptive meaning it takes place over time. And here we have cap t time periods. In each time period, we have a sample size of nt. So this is a repeated cross-section setting, going back to Martin's question from the beginning. We have multiple treatments d equal 1 to k, so in our application k is going to be 4. We have an outcome, which for just technical reasons, I'm going to assume is bounded. In the application, it's actually binary. And we have a discrete covariance. I'm going to put, so units are in discrete strata, 1, 2, and x. And then, as before, we have potential outcomes yd corresponding to the treatment arms d. And every unit is characterized by the potential outcomes for every treatment and by the observable covariance x. And I'm going to assume these are IID across both units and time. So I'm going to assume a stationary setting. And then we have average potential outcomes, theta dx. So that's kind of the equivalent of the FDX I had before, which are again the expectation of potential outcome yd conditional covariate value x. And a useful way of rewriting this, for which I'm going to use a lot for the rest of the talk, is in terms of regret. So regret is the difference between theta dx, the average outcome I achieve with treatment D, and the optimal treatment D prime, and the corresponding average outcome for that. So the maximum of theta D prime x minus theta dx. So delta dx measures how much worse D is relative to the optimum in the given stratum x. And if our goal is to maximize average welfare of participants, then that's equivalent to minimizing the average regret. Right? It's just a sign flip and adding a constant. And so average in-sample regret then is just the sum over all units of their delta dx, averaged over the number of units. And so one popular algorithm for assigning treatments in such setting is what's called Thompson sampling, which actually interestingly has been around pretty much as long as the idea of randomized experiments themselves, and which has been very popular in online experimentation by the big internet companies. And so the idea of Thompson sampling is quite simple. It's a Bayesian algorithm. You have some prior over average potential outcomes, and then you update this prior based on whatever information you have up to a given point. And then for your given covariate value x, you can calculate the posterior probability that each treatment is optimal. So PDX is the probability that D is optimal in stratum X, given whatever information we have at time t. Right, and this could, in principle, incorporate all kinds of fairly complicated models or priors. And so this idea has been around for a long time. Interestingly, optimality guarantees have been around for less than 10 years at this point, which has partly led to a revival of this banded literature, I think. And optimality guarantees for similar algorithms have also been provided more recently. And what we're going to do is not quite the Thompson sampling, but we're in some sense going to do a compromise between like the classical kind of balanced randomized experiment that where you assign each treatment arm is probability 1 over k, and Thompson sampling, and we're just going to do a simple linear combination between the two. So with probability gamma, we're going to do a standard balanced randomized experiment. With probability 1 minus gamma, we are going to do Thompson sampling. And so why are we doing this? Essentially because my development economics courses are kind of conflicted. They do want to help our participants, but they also want to publish estimates. And so we're trying to do both here. And so does this algorithm achieve that? Here's a theorem that's actually not too hard to prove from our paper. And what the theorem says is as the number of units get large, you get that the sample shares that you allocate to each of the treatments in each of the strata looks as follows. It's with probability gamma, you're going to do the fully randomized experiment. And so with that probability gamma, you're going to allocate each of the treatments to share 1 over k of observations, which means that the suboptimal observations get a share gamma over k. And then with probability 1 minus gamma, we're going to do Thompson, which in larger samples means that with probability 1 minus gamma, we're just going to allocate units to the optimal treatment. And so the optimal treatment in each stratum gets a sample share of 1 minus gamma plus gamma over k. And so given that this kind of posterior consistency result, it's kind of immediate that in-sample regret is going to be proportional to gamma. So the larger the share of pure randomization, the worse for your participants. And you're just going to lose in proportion to however much worse each treatment is relative to the optimum in the stratum. So that's the delta dx, and then weighted by stratum shares px. And on the other hand, if you're interested now in point estimates, turns out for this algorithm, you are actually asymptotically unbiased. And you get that just rescaling sample averages relative to the truth, scaled by total sample size, you converge to a normal distribution. So that's a central limit theorem for the adaptive case. And kind of the interesting part here is the denominator term, which is q bar dx. So that's the sample share from item 1, which means the smaller gamma is, the smaller q bar dx is going to be for the suboptimal treatments. And so you get a larger variance for the treatment effect estimate for them. And so what that implies is that you get this trade-off that's governed by gamma, in-sample regret is approximately proportional to the share gamma, so the proportional to the share is fully randomized. So increasing gamma is bad for participants. But on the other hand, if you look at the variance of average potential outcome estimators, or the difference thereof, then that's going to be decreasing gamma. So your treatment effect estimators are going to get more precise if gamma is larger. And so you can trade off the estimator variance and participant welfare by your choice of gamma. So what we did in the application, somewhat arbitrarily, was to set gamma equal to 0.2. That's kind of, which means with 4 treatments, you're going to have each observation, even in the limit, gets at least 5% of observations. Each treatment gets at least 5% of observations, since we have 4 treatments. So now let me switch to the actual empirical setting where we did this. So this was in the context of a job search assistance field experiment, where we're trying to do job search assistance for Syrian refugees in Jordan. So this is in collaboration with the International Rescue Committee. Was conducted in 2019 and 20 in Jordan. We have both Syrian refugees and Jordanians as part of the sample, so Jordanians are also included for political reasons. The experiment takes place in 2 locations, in Amman and Irbid, 2 cities in Jordan. Amman is the capital, and our total sample size is approximately 3,770 participants. And so the political context for this experiment was the so-called Jordan Compact, which a few years back was signed between the EU and Jordan. And the idea here was the EU would open trade to Jordan, to at least some sectors, to have free exports, in exchange for Jordan opening the labor market to refugees, the formal labor market to low-skilled jobs for refugees. And now this sounds very nice as an idea. In practice, what happened is that very few refugees actually did find formal jobs. And so in that context, the International Rescue Committee and others came in, trying to help actually make this happen. And so what we, in collaboration with the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, came up with was 3 treatments in the control group. The first treatment is just cash on hand, no questions asked, of 65 Jordanian dinars. The second one was an information treatment, so where the participants would get an information session, where they in particular get some training how to interview for a formal job, how to apply, and how that works in Jordan. And second, a bunch of information on labor law in Jordan and workers' rights. The third intervention was a psychological nudge intervention. So here the idea was that the participants would in the session make some plans, commit to the kind of jobs and the number of jobs they want to apply for and how they're going to look for them and so on. And then they would get somewhat regular text message reminders telling them about their plans and asking whether they actually followed up on their plans. And then we had a control group. And we're doing targeting here based on 16 strata, which are based on nationality, Jordanian, Syrian, gender, education, whether participants completed high school or more or not, and on their work experience, whether they have experience in formal wage employment. So as an econometrician, I've always been jealous of development economists for getting to put pretty pictures of interesting places they've been to. So for once I can do that too. Here is the locations in Amman and Irbid. So both of these are actually very urban. These are not refugees living in camps. They are actually living in the cities with Jordanians. Unfortunately, the outcome of the experiment was fairly depressing. Essentially, people don't find formal jobs. Initially, here in this experiment, what we get is that it looks like the psychological nudge intervention worked better. And so the algorithm started assigning more participants to the nudge. But then it turned out that it seemed to be mostly a statistical fluke, and we kind of converged back to pretty much balanced assignment. And then toward the end, it seemed like cash was better. And so you might wonder why this only starts at week 6 here. The reason is that we observe outcomes after 6 weeks. So participants get a phone call after 6 weeks whether they found a formal job. And essentially nobody finds formal jobs. So the job finding rate is around 4%. Here's the same thing kind of split up by subgroups. And there seems to be some heterogeneity. So for instance, for Syrian women without high school, it did appear like the cash intervention was actually effective, or say here for the Jordanian women with more than high school, like the nudge intervention was more effective. But by and large, most of this seems to be statistical noise if we look at the credible sets here for each group. I should emphasize, though, this is only for the 6-week outcomes, and we've started analyzing longer run outcomes that we didn't target in the experiment. And it seems for some of those, including job finding rates in the medium run, it was more successful. So results for that are pending. Let me again stop here and take some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Max. So we have a question by Kei Hirano. Kei, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes.
Perfect.
Hi, Max. Quick question
Okay.
about the theorem that you presented a few slides back. I was wondering, does that theorem require that the best treatment is unique? And if it is not unique, what does the kind of limiting theory look like?
So it does require that it's unique, because essentially what's in the background here is posterior consistency, that you converge to knowing this probability 1 in each stratum, which treatment is optimal. How the limiting theory looks like if it's not unique, I don't know. And I think there's also the interesting case, which obviously you've looked a lot, which is kind of the local to non-uniqueness case with treatment effects on the order of 1 over square root sample size, in which case, again, you wouldn't get the same type of results. And if you look at the banded literature, it's kind of also split between these 2 types of scenarios. Fixed parameters where you get posterior consistency and large deviations kick in, or kind of local parameters in which you don't get posterior consistency. This type of result doesn't apply. So short answer is in our algorithm, I'm not sure what happens in this local scenario.
Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. And we had another question by Michael Gechter. Michael, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yep. Hi, Max. Quick question about the application. What prior did you use in practice there?
So what we did here was a hierarchical Bayesian model. So we have binary outcomes, did find a job or not. And so then the upper level of the hierarchy is just a beta distribution for each of these average potential outcomes. Right? So that would be the conjugate to the binary outcome. But then we have a hyperprior, and the hyperprior connects the average potential outcome theta dx across the people in different strata for the same treatment. So essentially what that does is that within the sample we're estimating how much heterogeneity there is across strata and treatment effects, and what the average treatment effects are. And then basically implicitly what the Bayesian updating does is using this estimated heterogeneity in order to do the optimal amount of shrinkage within each stratum in order to predict average potential outcomes in that stratum. And so in large samples, that's the shrinkage across strata is going to be swamped by the data in the sample, in the stratum. But in small samples, then you might kind of have a pooling estimate that combines the information from your own stratum and from other strata.
Got it. Thanks.
Thank you. So there are a lot of questions coming in right now, but let me just ask one clarifying question directly by Joseph Abraham. So could you repeat what outcomes are desired in the experiment?
Yeah, so the outcome that we targeted here was having a formal job after 6 weeks. So basically the way this would work is that a caseworker would just get on the phone and call the participants and repeatedly call them. So we got a fairly low non-response rate actually, and ask them, do you have a formal job now? Now we are a little bit unhappy, I suppose, that that's what we targeted, because it seems to be the case that there was a much higher chance that they would get informal jobs, and it appears that, although that's preliminary, that our treatments actually did have an effect on these informal job finding rates, but that's not what the Tampere-Thompson sampling targeted here.
Okay, thank you. So in the interest of time, I let you move on, and we'll try to get to these other questions during the Q&A in the end. Thanks.
That's good, thank you. Okay, so let me move now to the third objective function, which is using the experiment for policy choice. And so we had the first objective was getting precise estimates for treatment effects. The second objective was getting good outcomes for the participants, or some combination with precise estimates. Now we're running the experiment, and we have a bunch of treatments, and after the experiment, picking one of the treatments for large-scale implementation. So you might think of something like a medical trial with several possible treatments, and then you get an FDA recommendation or something like that. And so the basic setup is the same here as in the last paper I talked about, so I'm not going to repeat it. I'm going to drop the covariates now just for simplicity of exposition. And so what changes is the objective function, which is now the following. After the experiment, we pick the treatment with the highest posterior mean, call that DT star, so that's the estimated best policy. And then we are going to evaluate the experiment based on how good this estimated policy is. And so in terms of the welfare theta of this chosen policy D star. And again, we can express welfare in terms of regret. So that's just a renormalization. So we can say how much worse is the chosen policy relative to the optimal one. And ex ante, it gives us the expected policy regret, RT here, which is the sum of all treatments, probability of picking the treatment, times how much worse the treatment is relative to the optimum. And delta D is just defined as before. So why might you care about this objective? I think there's a lot of practical scenarios where this is pretty much what we want. First, relative to the bandit setting, continuing experimentation is costly and requires oversight. So I was actually surprised. I was thinking this was definitely the case for field experiments, but turns out even talking to people, experiments usually to stop after some time, because just it usually takes like a labor of some PhD employee to overlook the experiment and so on. So they don't want to do this indefinitely. You might also have political constraints about keeping experimenting forever. And so as a result, you often get that experimental samples actually are quite small relative to policy population. To think again of clinical trials, for instance. So now comes kind of the most technical part of my talk. And I'm going to start by thinking about how does a good allocation look for this problem. And I'm going to ask an infeasible question, which is how would I pick the allocation if I knew what the treatment effects were, but then I'm not allowed to use the knowledge for picking the policy. So I'm just like say what would be the ideal sample shares if I pick the policy based on the sample outcomes. And in order to get there, I'm going to express this in terms of rates. So how fast does policy regret go to zero as sample size increases? With a good treatment assignment algorithm or good sample shares, we'll have that policy regret goes to zero very quickly. And if you look at the rates, the exponential rate at which policy regret goes to zero, then it's fairly immediate from the expression for policy regret. That's just dominated by its lowest convergence to zero of the probability of picking each suboptimal treatment. Right, so we want each of these probabilities going to zero as fast as possible. Now, what does the speed at which these probabilities go to zero depend on? Well, it depends on the sample share that's allocated to the treatment, and it depends on the delta D, which is basically the treatment effect, or how much worse the treatment is relative to the optimal treatment. So the larger the treatment effect, the faster you go to zero, the larger the sample share, the faster you go to zero. And you can express this explicitly using large deviation theory. And this is also equal to the rate of convergence of the posterior probability that each treatment is optimal. And now if you combine 1 and 2, what we get is essentially you want to pick the sample shares Q bar such that you equalize the rate of convergence towards zero for each of the suboptimal treatments. So you want all of them to go to zero as fast as possible, and then policy regret goes to zero at that same speed. But because if you didn't do that, if one went faster to zero than another, then you could decrease the sample share allocated to the fast one and increase the one allocated to the slow one. And then overall your speed is going to increase and your policy regret is going to shrink faster. Now this is an infeasible recommendation. So this recommendation that you essentially want to equalize power for all these comparisons of the best treatment to the suboptimal ones. It's infeasible because it requires knowledge of the true treatment effects. So how do we construct something that's feasible and behaves in the same way? Well, first idea might be, let's go back to Thompson sampling. Could that be a candidate? Turns out the answer is no. So there's this result from 2012, which says Thompson sampling actually is rate optimal for the bandit problem, where we care about the participant welfare. But it turns out in terms of rates, it's actually very much not optimal for the policy problem. It turns out it has only a polynomial rate of convergence for that one, whereas just the simple like equal shares assignment has an exponential rate. Instead, what we do is we introduce this algorithm that we call exploration sampling. exploration, because it's basically like a pure exploration problem where we don't care about the exploitation part, if you're familiar with that language. And so what we're doing here is we take the Thompson probabilities, the probability that each treatment is optimal, but then we transform it, and we transform it into this QDT, which is P times 1 minus P, and then the whole thing normalized across the treatment arms. And so what this is doing, it's a concave transformation of P, and it's pushing all treatment arms down to a probability below 1/2, but it's preserving monotonicity. So if P is higher, then the Q corresponding Q is also going to be higher. This is true because the P's have to sum up to 1. Turns out this assignment achieves a constraint form of rate optimality and actually massively improves performance in our simulations. And so let me state the theorem formally. To consider this algorithm that I just introduced, exploration sampling. Assume we have some fixed wave size and assume that the best treatment has an average outcome less than 1, and that the optimal policy is unique. So that's again going back to Kehiran's question from before. We do need uniqueness of the optimal policy for the large deviations results to kick in. Then we get the following behavior as the number of waves increases. We get first the share of observations that's assigned to the best treatment converges to 1/2. Second, we get the share of the observations that's assigned to each of the suboptimal treatments converges to a non-random sample share, Q bar, and that share is exactly the one I just derived for the infeasible allocation. So it's exactly the share that makes each of the posterior probabilities go to 0 at the same speed, which is the same thing as saying it makes the power go to 0 at the same speed for each of the suboptimal treatment arms. And then because of that, and because of the form of policy regret, we get the policy regret goes to 0 at the same speed, and there is no other assignment share which has that one hold, so which has converges to 1/2 for the best treatment, such that this policy regret goes to 0 at a faster rate. And why is this true? So this relies on a bunch of lemmas from these papers from the operations research literature. Well, the first one is again just for a consequence of posterior consistency, which is not entirely trivial in this setting to show. But after posterior consistency, this follows from the form of exploration sampling, that you have that the treatment which has P going to 1 has Q going to 1/2. So that's just then follows from the algebraic expression. Now, kind of here is in some sense the most interesting part of the underlying logic, which is suppose you have one treatment arm which has the posterior probability going to 0 at a faster rate. Then what exploration sampling would do, because of this monotonicity of treatment assignment, is it would just stop assigning this treatment arm. But because you stop assigning this treatment arm, then the other treatment arms can catch up until you kind of have equalized again this posterior probability. So you're automatically equalizing the rates of convergence because of this catch-up dynamic and stabilizing behavior of the exploration sampling algorithm. And then based on the arguments we made for the infeasible allocation, we get that the balancing this rate of convergence implies efficiency in this restricted class. And so that follows from this oracle argument that I made before. Now for this algorithm, we again have an empirical application from development economics. This one unfortunately was successful, so that's good. This took place in Odisha in India in 2019 in collaboration with the NGO Precision Agriculture for Development. So this was co-founded by Michael Kramer, among others. And the idea of precision agriculture for development is to phone-based agricultural outreach to subsistence farmers, in particular in Africa and South Asia, as a way of like have scalable extension service. Like these are kind of among the poorest people on earth, but most of them do have mobile phone access at this point. And I guess the idea of this NGO is that there's actually a bunch of things they could do to improve their food security and agricultural output. And so we came in like as part of like the rollout phase of their of their service in Odisha in India. So we had a sample of 10,000 observations. We divided them into waves of 600. And we have 6 treatments, maybe not the most exciting treatments here, but still practically relevant, which were just varying the time of day at which farmers were called, and for each of them, whether or not they would get a warning message beforehand, and what time the warning message would arrive. And so the goal here is to maximize enrollment, where enrollment here is measured by people get these calls and then they answer 5 questions on the phone. And if they have answered all these 5 questions, then they are enrolled in the service, and we code this as a success. So again, some pictures if you're wondering where Odisha is. It's this state in East India. And the right-hand side is like a typical paddy farming plot for rice farming in that region. Here things worked beautifully. The experiment exactly went as the theorem predicted. So initially we are unsure which of the algorithms is optimal. There's kind of some jiggling around of assignment shares, but then as knowledge gets accumulated, we get that assignment shares converge to what looks like non-random shares. The best treatment is assigned to just below 1/2 the observations, and it's monotonic for the other ones, and it stabilizes over time. And here would be kind of the final results expressed numerically. So if you want to call farmers in Odisha, you do it at 10 a.m. and send them a message 1 hour beforehand. With 75.4% zero probability, this is the optimal thing to do. And note that the treatment effects here are actually rather small. So we do need this kind of efficiency of the adaptive procedure in order to actually detect them with high certainty. But doing that, then we end up allocating 3,930 observations to the best treatment out of our 10,000 observations, and then monotonically for the suboptimal ones. So the last one here is the second best, which got 1,500 observations and so on. And we get that the suboptimal ones are at least roughly on the same order of magnitude in terms of zero probability optimal. So, by the way, here the prior that we used was just a simple beta prior, again, for the Bernoulli model. So this is nice and easy to analytically update. And let me again stop here and ask for questions.
Yeah, we have multiple questions. So could I ask Kelly Zhang to ask her questions? You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, I was wondering if you consider frequentist evaluations of treatment effects, or like confidence intervals, or do you see a particular advantage of looking at Bayesian evaluations?
So, I mean, there's a bunch of things to be said here, like in terms of the theoretical evaluation here. So the theorem here is frequentist, right? So this is a characterization that's conditional on the parameter vector theta t. So that's
I mean for the
prior. Even though we use the prior for like doing inference afterwards.
Yes.
So for that, yeah, exactly. So for that, it turns out you can just look at sample averages and do basically the way you would usually do inference. Turns out that is actually asymptotically valid. So, but that's true for this particular algorithm. It's not true for any adaptive procedure. And so the reason is, with adaptive assignment, you get bias in the sample means. Essentially, the reason is if a treatment is less successful, you're assigning less of it, and that it produces a little bit of downward bias in the sample averages of outcomes for the treatment arms. So you do get bias, and that's actually a serious issue if you use one of the bandit algorithms. Turns out for either the Tampere-Thompson algorithm or for the exploration sampling algorithm, because each of the treatment arms gets a sample share that's bounded below by 0 in terms of how many observations are allocated to it, standard asymptotics kick in, and you could just use the sample mean and the usual standard error in order to do confidence intervals here, and it would be asymptotically valid and equivalent to the credible sets in the limit too.
Okay. Thank you. And we had another question by Sukjin Han. Sukjin, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, Max. I have a question, maybe it's slightly beyond scope of your talk, but so the decision to participate in the next experiment is endogenous, and it might reveal preference of the important preference information about the participants. And I guess it would be useful to incorporate such information in finding optimal treatments, and in which case you may want to obtain data for non-participants as well. And I guess the same idea applies to a situation where you have attenuation of participants across time if you have a multi-period setup.
So I mean, I think this is a very interesting and relevant point, that the participation experiments is endogenous. I mean, my cop-out answer would be that that's not what my papers deal with here. They're like conditional on the sample selection. But maybe the more interesting answer is, I think both for actually the Thompson or Tabord-Thompson or this exploration sampling algorithm, they have this property that they allocate more participants to the better treatment. So in some sense, they make it more interesting to participate in the experiment, right? So say you're in a clinical trial and you have a high chance of getting the best treatment, that's kind of more appealing than keeping to have a high chance of getting the placebo or a bad treatment. And so in that sense, the genetic algorithm actually changes the self-selection into experiments. And I think from a political economy perspective, there's a big point to be made that a lot more partner organizations, but also individual participants might be inclined to participate in experiments if they feel that the way the experiment is designed actually aligns with their objectives, rather than having this conflict between, oh, you just want to keep experimenting and randomly assigning, but we already know what's good. We want to just do what's best for our stakeholders. And of course, like incorporating information that goes a bit beyond like about self-selection into the experiment, it goes a bit beyond that. I'm not entirely sure how I would do that, so I have to think more about that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so in the interest of time, Max, I let you continue at this point.
Yeah, so given that I'm almost out of time, I'm not really going to go into the details on this like work in progress projects. One thing to note again is that that what I've done so far is evaluate welfare in terms of observed outcomes, which is common in a program evaluation type setting, but is very different from what you would do in public finance or similar fields, where optimal policy is usually defined in terms of the utility of participants as quantified by equivalent variation of policy changes. Turns out you can still do something in these settings. You can express welfare based on some transformation of objects. You can learn from the data, so something like consumer surplus. And you can do patient updating on those. I'll skip the details here, but so work in progress would be to design adaptive algorithms that maximize the expected welfare of policy choices in this utilitarian sense for policy choice based on the experiment. And then let me maybe also briefly mention this project here, which we just posted a policy paper, kind of in light of the current situation, where the question is, like, a lot of countries have limited testing capacity. We can't test everybody for COVID infections. And so then the question is, how do we use this limited testing capacity? And so two leading approaches that people have advocated before would be just to test all symptomatic patients on the one hand, or to do random samples to get like an unbiased estimate of prevalence in the population. And so the question we asked in this policy paper was to how to optimally use limited testing resources if you can target on observables such as symptoms, contact history, demographics, and so on, geographic location, and if you can adapt over time as you observe the outcomes of previous COVID tests. And so this is kind of like a bandit problem. It's not quite a bandit problem because it depends on like what the downstream decisions are based on the test. And so I guess the leading one that we focus on here would be whether or not to quarantine somebody, and you might also like quarantine people or not without a test. And of course, you don't want to quarantine people who are healthy, and you don't want to have people who are infected go around and infect others. And so because of this, this kind of two-sided nature of the type 1 to type 2 error losses of releasing people, turns out what's optimal is actually to test people in kind of the middle in terms of predicted probability of infection. And because of the kind of the dynamic bandit trade-offs, so the exploitation trade-off, it makes sense to spread out testing capacity a bit more, like in this kind of illustrative picture down here, there on the horizontal axis, we have the posterior probability of being affected, given whatever we know about you and given the history of tests. And then as your predictions get more and more certain, kind of this concentrates, and in the limit you get this myopically optimal testing probability, which is the gray line, where you test people with an intermediate probability of infection. And this is kind of the way of minimizing harms from falsely releasing or falsely quarantining people. All right, so let me conclude and summarize and wrap up what this talk was about. So kind of the big picture point started with was that any decision problem requires specification of an objective, and that really matters. We shouldn't just go with like the default objective from textbook, just run it up without thinking what the objective is that the design maximizes. Instead, I think there's a lot to be gained from thinking through what you actually want to achieve. And so I gave 4 examples here of which are obviously not exhaustive, but I think cover an interesting range of settings or things that you might want to achieve. You might care about point estimates, or relatedly about testing or confidence intervals, which kind of leads to the classic stratification arguments, or like the non-randomization version that I presented here. You could care about in-sample regret, which is the objective of bandit algorithms, or some combination of 2 and 1, which is what we focused on in the Jordan experiment. You could care about policy regret, in which case we introduced this exploration sampling algorithm and some theoretical guarantees for it. Or you could care about policy regret, but in this utilitarian sense. And so I proposed simple kind of heuristic algorithms for each of these. So the first one, I guess, is actually fully optimal if you manage to solve the discrete optimization problem here. However, you won't be able to solve this because with 2 treatments and n observations, you have 2 to the n possible treatment assignments, which just very quickly becomes numerically infeasible to enumerate all of them. So you do have to find some heuristic optimization here as well. But so leaving that aside, there is this balance objective function which you can try to minimize in order to get good treatment assignments. And then we had for the Tabord-Thompson algorithm, which is essentially a convex combination of Thompson sampling, the assigning treatment based on the probability optimal, and balanced randomization. We had the exploration sampling algorithm, which is taking these Thompson probabilities, but sorry, half a minute. Taking these Thompson probabilities and doing this concave transformation, essentially pushing down the best treatment and maintaining monotonicity in order to get good power for each of all of the comparisons of the best treatment to the suboptimal ones. So, but here's the problem if the deterministic procedures you need is derived from first principles, which we want to minimize if you care about mean squared error. And we had these 2 performance guarantees for Tabord-Thompson sampling and exploration sampling. And lastly, if you're interested in playing around with these or doing some variant of it yourself, I have R code and corresponding interactive apps that you can play around with on my homepage. So you can just go there and try them out, maybe use them for your own experiment. And basically the way they work is just you upload whatever information you have so far and download the recommended treatment assignment. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Max. So we will go to the discussants now. We asked the discussants to give just 5 minutes discussions without slides. And let's start with David McKenzie from the World Bank. And David, I give the word to you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And thanks, Max. This was fantastic. And, you know, this is a really nice research agenda. I think sort of putting this overview and seeing how the different pieces come together was great. And, you know, I really appreciate your willingness to sort of get out there and apply this in real life, as well as just sort of working through all the math here. So I wanted to make 3 points on this. So the first one is related to your headline question of what do we want and when do we want it when we do experiments? And I think, you know, you touched on a key point there, which is that the answer to that is going to vary a lot depending on who you're talking to. It's going to vary for different researchers, for different policymakers, for the subjects of the experiment themselves, you know, for the editors and the referees. And so I think that's what troubles me a lot with this is you're great in forcing us to be explicit about what that objective is, but I think often there's not a single objective in these. And so, for example, let's take your refugees in Jordan, where your algorithm looks at, can we get people in formal work in 6 weeks, right? So what does success mean for a jobs program? Is success, I get somebody into a job in 6 weeks when it was going to take 7 weeks otherwise for them? Is it that I get somebody into a job who was not going to get a job without this assistance? Is it that I get them into a better match for a job, that they stick in longer? Is it that I sort of place somebody into a job that doesn't just crowd out somebody else, right? Each of these are different objectives, and they're going to have, different interventions are probably going to do better at different parts of those. So maybe cash helps you search for a job for longer. It doesn't look so good at 6 weeks, but you stick in your job, well. Nudging gets people to take action sooner, but maybe those jobs are not very good jobs, etc. And so, if these are questions we have to face with non-adaptive experiments as well. But there we have sort of the advantage of being agnostic, of sort of saying, here's the range of results. Pick and choose. If you're somebody who really cares about 6 weeks, this is what treatment you might want. If you're somebody who cares about getting people into high quality jobs, this is the treatment you want. And we don't have to take such an explicit stand. And so I think, this is sort of one thing to think about, is what would agnostic, robust sort of methods of doing adaptive experiments look like? And you could of course put weights on all these things and say, okay, I'm going to put this much weight on this thing and this much weight on these things. But I think in practice, we like to be a little agnostic there. The second thing is sort of thinking about a different type of robustness, which is sort of robustness to noise and robustness to outliers. And so, in a standard experiment, outliers affect how we evaluate the outcomes, but they don't affect how we allocate subjects to treatment. So in contrast with some of these optimal experiments, if we think about, for example, your don't randomize, just sort of find the optimal solution, and your example of age. Suppose we have a 100-year-old in the study, a bunch of 5-year-olds, and then everyone else is sort of 30. If we're trying to then get balance on age, what are we going to do? We're going to put the 100-year-old in a group with all the 5-year-olds, and then the mean age for that group is going to be the same as all the 30-year-olds. And of course, that's just stupid. Like, we could say, okay, I'm not just going to balance on age, I'm going to balance on, the fraction of people that are under 30 and the fraction of people that are there. But if we're not careful about it, sort of by trying to force that balance on, to get the exact optimal solution, we can sort of be very oversensitive to noise. And I think that's the case also, perhaps in some of the adaptive experimentation. Things can jump around and we can react a little bit too much to news. I think that's perhaps less of a case in the binary outcome case, but if we're sort of trying to optimize continuous outcomes, then, if we get one person who gets a really good draw, we're going to suddenly, move a little bit more towards that than we might otherwise think. So that's sort of one type of robustness. I think the sort of second related point is, in real life, there's attrition and things are messy, and sort of how robust are our methods of analysis to being able to deal with sort of the messiness of incomplete compliance, attrition, outliers, things like that. So that's, again, as we move from the theory to the application. Then the final point I wanted to just sort of note is thinking about when this works well and when it doesn't work well, is sort of, when are we in a high noise, hard to learn environment versus a quick, adaptive, we can learn things quickly environment. And so your sort of case of the cell phones was good there. We could learn very quickly. We could see, quickly, when do we get people to pick up the phone? When do we not? Whereas the jobs, it's really hard to know. We know from a lot of our work, we do massive samples, we spend years, and then we still have real trouble saying whether our jobs programs work or not. And so, thinking about when these methods are going to be more useful and when they're going to be less useful, I think in these sort of high noise, hard to learn environments, it's going to be quite tricky. And there, maybe this gamma that you have should sort of depend somehow in this tempered Thompson on how noisy the situation is, how sort of quickly I can learn, and your posterior captures that to some extent. But I think, we might also want to think about how much weight I put on learning versus exploitation, depending on, is this an environment where I can really learn that much? The sort of final related point on that is that I don't just care, even in the take-up examples, about whether people pick up the phone, but I might also care about who picks up the phone and whether the type of treatment affects how they respond when they do pick it up. And so, here, and this again gets to, your question of what is our objective? What do we care about? And I think often in these experiments, we care about not just what the take-up is, but also, the characteristics of who's taking it up and whether those treatments affect, what happens when they do take it up as well. But, I think this whole agenda is really nice, and you force us to ask uncomfortable questions, which about, why are we doing all this work in the first place? And I think it's often hard for us to answer those questions. And so thanks very much for pushing us in that direction. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much, David. So we will let Max reply after we had both discussants. So our second discussant is Max Tabord-Meehan from the University of Chicago. And thank you, Max.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to the discussants, and thank you for having me. I think all of the papers that Max presented today were all really interesting. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on one, which is the exploration sampling paper. So just to recap what that paper is about, or at least how I think about the paper, the ultimate objective here is to take data from a randomized experiment and select the treatment with the highest average outcome to treat a population. And the decision rule that's going to get used in this paper is we're going to take the Bayes action, right? So we're going to take data from the randomized experiment, combine it with a prior on the class of DGPs that we could face. We're going to form a posterior, and then we're going to choose the policy which maximizes the posterior mean. So that's good. That's a classical, very well-studied decision rule. What this paper is doing is it's asking, okay, how can we adaptively assign treatment in the randomized experiment to make the regret of the Bayes decision rule converge quickly, all right? And I think it comes up with a very, very nice solution, which they call exploration sampling. The idea being we're going to modify Thompson sampling in a way that makes it so that we're only focusing on exploration, and we're not so much concerned about exploitation along the path. So, I mean, I think that's a really nice suggestion. What I was thinking about while I was reading the paper was, okay, if the starting point in this paper is using a Bayes decision rule, what could we say if we wanted our starting point to be something else? What if we wanted to start with a decision rule that didn't involve specifying a prior? And I think probably the most natural candidate to think about in the treatment choice context would be to look for the decision rule which minimizes maximum regret, right? So the idea here is we're going to look for a decision rule which which minimizes the worst case regret over all possible DGPs that we could face. And this is also a very classical decision rule. It goes back to Wald, and I think was popularized in econometrics more recently by Chuck Mansky in subsequent papers. And so we could think about in this context, okay, let's try to minimize over both the decision rule and the experimental design, right? So we're gonna try to minimize worst case regret over both of those features at the same time. And I was just trying to think through, okay, well, what could we say if we tried to do that? And I think in general, trying to characterize that in finite samples and give a very sharp result is very difficult. But at least in the case of two treatments, I am aware of some results in that direction. So in particular, Jörg Steuer has a series of papers where he shows that, again, in the case of two treatments, in the setting that Max considered in his talk today, the minimax optimal regret thing to do is take half the sample, put it into treatment, take the other half of the sample, put it into the second treatment, and then just choose the policy, the treatment that has a higher average, sample average. All right, that's up to some tie breaking, which I won't worry about. And he actually mentions in a footnote that, again, in this two treatment case, adaptation in the experiment doesn't buy you anything from a minimax regret perspective. So I thought that was interesting. But again, that's the two treatment case. So what happens in the multiple treatment case, more than two treatments, which is the setting that Max is considering in his paper. So I'm not aware of any very sharp results in that setting, to the level that was in the Jörg Steuer papers. But there's an interesting paper by Odibert and co-authors that studies the regret convergence rates of what to me looks like a kind of generalization of this decision rule, which they call successive rejects. So how successive rejects works is we divide the experiment up into a bunch of phases. In each phase, we just use all the remaining treatments equally. And then at the end of the phase, we just drop the worst performing treatment based on the sample average. All right, so that by the end of the experiment, after having gone through all these phases, we're left with one treatment. And what I thought was interesting about this procedure is, okay, it has nice regret convergence properties, but also in the case of exactly 2 treatments, it actually boils down exactly to the original rule that Jörg Stoyer derived in his papers, again, up to some tie breaking. So I thought that was just kind of an interesting way of motivating this successive rejects algorithm. And so that kind of leads me to the 2 questions that I have for Max. The first question is, in general, if we're going to start from the Bayes decision rule, how sensitive is your procedure to the choice of prior that we're going to use? And I guess that's a question for all the procedures that you talked about today. How, you know, we're using a frequentist evaluation of the procedure, but how does the performance change based on the choice of prior? And then my second question is whether or not you've experimented with other possible competitors. So how would exploration sampling compare to a method like successive rejects, or maybe a modified version of UCB or something like that? You know, given that, I guess you started with a flat prior in your simulations. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Max. Now I let the other Max respond to both of the discussants, but let's try to leave a little bit of time in the end for more audience questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. A lot of really great points. So I'll try to cover at least some of them. So first point, there's often multiple objectives, completely granted, both in the narrow sense of we care multiple outcome variables. So for instance, for the participants in our experiment, in a bigger sense of like care about estimation and participant welfare and so on. I mean, I think on an abstract philosophical level, I would say there's no way you can not choose. Right? Like any choice you make is implicitly going to trade these off. Personally, I prefer making the trade-off more explicit rather than less. But I can see how that can be difficult in practice, and so sometimes you want to have defaults for making these trade-offs. But I think it would be really productive to have these conversations explicitly, even if you don't have a full resolution of what you actually end up targeting. Even also just to think of like what are the outcomes that you care about and so on. I think that's like an eminently important discussion to have. In terms of noise and outliers. So I guess there were several different points there. So you were mentioning in this example of like balancing on age, and then 100-year-old and a few 5-year-olds, and then you put those in the same group and everybody else in the other group. That only happens if you only balance on the mean, right? So if you care about making the average age in both groups the same, but actually the type of objective function I put up there cares about the entire joint distribution. So my prediction would be it would not do that because it cares about more than the mean. The only way you end up caring about only the mean is if you dogmatically assume a model that's linear and the covariates. If you're really sure that they only matter additively, then yes, the 100-year-old and the 5-year-old cancel, and then that's not a good idea. Now, outliers in terms of the adaptive outcomes. So in terms of the theorems, I mean, it's again a bit of a cop-out. I always assumed bounded outcomes precisely to avoid any of these kind of issues. It could happen, of course, if you have like some really good outcome for somebody or some mismeasurement or whatever, that really shifts your priors a lot. I think it's a good idea to think through beforehand how like Bayesian updating works in order to avoid these things, and bounded outcomes are generally a good way of remaining robust with respect to that type of issue. Attrition, I have less of a good answer to that, I think. We were lucky in our settings that it was not really an issue. I mean, in the phone case, because it's just the outcome is realized immediately. In the Jordan case, because our partner put a ton of effort in really making sure to track down everybody. It's not going to be the case in general. So again, I think one has to be careful of how learning or updating works based on data with iteration, what kind of ignorability one assumes, and so on. So then there were, like, I guess, a bunch of questions which span both of your comments, which is this question: do we, how fast can we learn? Are we like in a high signal or low signals regime? And so my understanding is like that a lot of this adaptive literature is kind of split in terms of results of two flavors. One is kind of the fixed parameter setting, which is in some sense the high signal type asymptotics, where in large samples you learn with high probability which the optimal treatments are and so on. And that's the flavor that the theorems I put up today were into. And so in that case, we talk about exponential rate of convergence of some probability going to 0. Could be also the rate of convergence for power, which is basically going to be the same. Another scenario that also goes back to Kehirano's question earlier is, well, what happens if the optimum is not unique? Basically, you're in or like close to non-unique, then you're in kind of a low signal scenario. And turns out, from a bandit perspective, the worst case scenario is when the treatment effect is on the order of 1/√n away from 0, because that's the scenario where it takes you just until the very end before you have some guess of which one the optimal treatment is, until you have some power. But at the same time, it matters which treatment you choose along the way, because the treatment effect is still not 0. If the treatment effect gets smaller, it doesn't really matter what you do. If it's larger, you figure out early which one is the optimum, and you just end up doing that. And the worst case is here if you're in kind of this intermediate world. And so if you have like this worst case regret bounds for bandit algorithms or other things, they're essentially driven by this like intermediate signal scenario. I think both of those can be practically interesting as witnessed by our 2 empirical applications, as we've seen exposed. And I don't have a good understanding yet, I think, for how the policy choice problem works in kind of the lower intermediate signal world. I want to understand this better. Right, so now to Max's comments, maybe just, I'm not entirely sure if I understood everything. Maybe one thing to notice, I don't use Bayes decision rules here, right? I use decision rules that depend on a prior, but they're not Bayes optimal decision rules. So I'm not solving like a Bayes risk minimization problem in order to get them. They're just some rules that start off as heuristic rules that they happen to depend on a prior. In a way, if you fix a default prior, you can just call them frequentists. Right? Just tell you, start with a uniform prior for average potential outcomes on the interval 0, 1, and always do that. Don't pick that in a subjective manner, then it is like a procedure, I would argue. The evaluations that we had were frequentist. Now, I think that was, so I have to ask you afterwards about the reference you talked about by Stoya and by Audibert. So the worst case regret, my suspicion would be that that actually again happens in this like intermediate scenario of like intermediate sized treatment effects relative to the optimum, where like treatment effects on the order of 1/√n. And that might be exactly the scenario where the activity doesn't buy you anything, because it takes until the very end of the experiment until you can actually have a good guess which one is the better treatment. And so in that sense, the adaptive worst case regret becomes the same one as the non-adaptive one. But then I guess my hunch would be that maybe this worst case regret is not a very good guide to picking a decision rule, because it in some ways excludes all the scenarios where adaptivity could be interesting. Right, so are there possible competitor rules? So exploration sampling is by no means unique, right? So there are other versions of doing something similar which kind of preserve the monotonicity in posterior probability, and at the same time push the best treatment away from one in order to get power that's to not load all the observations in the best treatment, which is bad for power. So even within this Bayesian class of algorithms, there are many others. Also, I think you could come up with all kinds of algorithms that don't refer to a prior in any explicit manner. So posterior probability here again is basically the same thing as power. So you could just take point estimates of power and use those as your selection criterion. You would essentially get the same thing, right? So then you would just use the frequentist terminology of power. But I'm sure there's all kinds of other variants. Maybe some modification of UCB could do the trick too. So, yeah, so I'll stop there.
Perfect. Thank you, Max. So we have 5 minutes left, so let's try to get to a few more audience questions. One was from Sergio Garrido. I think, Sergio, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering what is basically the relation between the exploration algorithm you exposed and the Bayesian optimization for experimental design. I think you mentioned little bit briefly on slide 36, 37, but I didn't get the full picture. Thank you.
So I mean, it is in a similar flavor. So I guess patient optimization I would think of as a problem definition, which is kind of similar to basically our policy choice problem. Just maybe if background comes from, I guess, trying to actually optimize some function, and function evaluation is expensive, and that's kind of similar to observations in a sample being expensive or of limited availability, and so therefore it's kind of comes from the equivalent. My understanding, to the extent that I know that literature, is that they've gone a slightly different route and particularly focused on algorithms like the knowledge gradient algorithm, which I briefly, I guess I didn't really get to talk about it in the context of the utility policy choice problem. That's the route I want to go down, where what the knowledge gradient method does is in some ways like a one period ahead truncated version of the dynamic optimization problem, where basically you're pretending you choose your policy or your optimum point after the next observation, and you're asking yourself what's now your expected posterior maximum, and use that as kind of your criterion for picking an observation point now. And so it's kind of like it's computationally a lot more involved than exploration sampling or Thompson sampling. It's much harder to compute. But I think it's interesting to explore for these more complicated objectives. And the other thing I still have to figure out for that one is how to deal with batching when you do a bunch of observations at the same time in the knowledge gradient method. But maybe there's literature out there on that, so I still have to find it. I don't know if that answers, but.
Okay, thank you. Then there was a question by Andrei Sraka. Andrei, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. Basically, two short questions. Firstly, you mentioned at the start the Gaussian process prior that you use, but in the analysis and in the theorems, as far as I noted, it was nowhere used. So it relates to the previous questions. How do the results depend, and why did you choose then this prior? Does it relate to your results? Is the non-parametrics involved in any of the convergence results and so on? And second one, if I understood correctly, basically you said that the variance decreases with gamma, which basically means, if I understand this correctly, possibly wrong, but that you put more pronouncement on the randomization component than on the original Thompson component. If this is right, why basically then, how do you explain this? Why is the Thompson then so important?
All right. Oh yeah, so I actually missed it out on the previous questions too, like the role of the prior and robustness. So numerically, without a theorem, my sense is like for this first problem of minimizing mean squared error, it's quite robust to the prior choice, and essentially the reason why is because all of them want to make the treatment group and the control group look as similar as possible in terms of all the covariates. And so then different priors are going to differ at the margin of one observation. Do you care more about age or about gender or whatever like the variables are that you have in there? But just for like the one marginal observation, overall they want to make both samples look similar in that regard. The Gaussian process part was kind of to avoid the issue that David McKenzie alluded to before. You don't want to just have this parametric assumption that's kind of implicit in like just balancing the means, when you can get this like silly situations where you just have like both the extremes in one sample and then the middle part in the other treatment arm, and that's something that's avoided by allowing for nonlinear fractional relationships, which you could, for instance, model with the Gaussian process prior, where the Gaussian part does only kick in so far as I only care about the second moments here. So I only care about means and variances, and so Gaussian is just one way of pinning this down. In terms of the estimate of variance decreases with gamma, that's exactly right. So having a larger gamma is good for the precision of treatment effect estimates, but it's bad for the participants because more participants get allocated to the suboptimal treatments. And so from the participants' point of view, they would prefer if gamma is set equal to 0. The referee's point of view, who care just about the point estimate, the best thing is to set gamma equal to 1. We were trying to trade it off and making an intermediate gamma.
Thank you.
Okay, so Unfortunately, we're really running out of time at this point. I did promise to ask a couple of more questions and let people ask questions. So I apologize if that's now not taking place. I would really like to thank Max, David, and Max for the presentation and for the discussions. This was really great. Thank you so much. Then I want to also say that we would like everybody to give us feedback. So there's a feedback form on the website of the Chamberlain Seminar, and there you can give us feedback on the format of the seminar or on future topics or future speakers and everything else you could think of. And finally, I would like to let you go with an invitation to attend our next Chamberlain Seminar in 2 weeks on June 5th. We will have Christoph Rother. And if you want to learn something about fuzzy regression discontinuity designs, that's where you should be in 2 weeks. Thank you so much.